Hello, welcome back to Japanese Culture. My name is Yutaka Kubo. I am an associate professor in School of International Studies. I will be your instructor of this course for week 6 and 7. I am specialized in film studies, focusing on reconstructing the history of Japanese cinema from queer perspectives. You can see my email address and my office number on this slide. So if you have any questions about the lecture, or if you are interested in cinema in general or visual culture, please feel free to make an appointment and talk about cinema. This is the third part of this lecture series, Japanese Culture. My lecture, We Are Here, is divided into two installments, and its purpose is to trace the development of Japanese queer cinema from 1945 to the 2010s. The first installment today focuses on the development up to the 1980s. I'm going to introduce you to the following. First, some examples of classic Japanese films that have been subject to interpretations against the grain. Second, a few examples from film adaptations from the 1950s and 1960s to illustrate how the body of bunge eiga possibly functioned as a platform for visualizing lesbian desires on the screen. Third, 1960s experimental films to experiment with the queer landscape. And lastly, some examples from pink films that depicted lesbians, gay men, and transgenders from the 1970s to the 1980s. Next week, we'll focus on the time periods from the 1990s and onwards. Before we start our journey through the post-war era in Japan, let us first learn the definition of the word queer and the possible definition of queer films. The English word queer was a derogatory term used against homosexual men in America already in the 1910s. It meant strange and peculiar with a very negative nuance. In today's sense, when we say queer, it includes more sexualities and gender identities than what LGBT can include. So, in other words, queer is often used as an umbrella term that contains lesbians, gays, bisexuals, transgenders, and people who are not included in LGBT, but also outside the heteronormative understanding of sexuality and gender. It's important to understand this word as something that does not point at individual identity or sexual desire, but focus rather more on the collectiveness of people at the margin as well as being very political. And there is a reason why the word queer is a political word. In the 1960s, there was the homophile movement in the US in order to emphasize their sense of community and de-emphasize the sexual aspect of their identity that concerned the public, working towards raising awareness and providing education. Yet, with the break of the Stonewall riots in 1969, motivating sexual minorities in the US to powerfully emphasize their identity as non-heterosexual in their fights for equal rights and against homophobia, fueling the gay liberation movement in the 1970s. This was a time when lesbian and gay studies in humanities emerged as well. It is crucial that the gay liberation movement emphasized the identity politics, meaning that sexual orientations and gender identities of those involved with the movement were the key to the movement itself. However, there was a significant turn in how the gay liberation movement shifted to a new path. And that turn was caused by the emergence of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s. Many people in gay communities contracted HIV through sexual intercourse, died of AIDS during the regime of the President Ronald Reagan, who did not invest in the treatment of HIV and AIDS. It was because HIV was considered as a gay disease and gay cancer. The identity politics of being lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders became powerless against the fear and panic of HIV in 1980s America. It was because those who tested HIV positive were not necessarily identified themselves as gays or lesbians. Another example included women of color who worked in sex work business, drug users, and those people in social minority group. These people were often marginalized in American society, and because their daily lives often involved sex work and drug business, it was often seen that they became victims of HIV. Of course, of those people in the marginalized groups, there were gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and transgenders as well. But to be a victim of HIV, that you were a gay or a lesbian did not matter. In other words, sexual orientations or gender identities did not matter in front of the fear of HIV and AIDS. Therefore, the gay liberation movement in 1980s America under the fear of HIV shifted to a new direction and became the AIDS activism as a social movement that placed a more emphasis on the state of being at the margin than identity. In such a drastic change of the social activism came a new group of social activism called Queer Nation. Queer Nation aimed to stop discrimination, violence, and oppression against the LGBTQ communities in 1980s America. They often used the slogan that said, "We are here, we are queer, get used to it." This slogan is a similar way to the 1970s gay liberation movement that defied an apologetic attitude toward the social system that oppressed the minority. The aim of Queer Nation was to eradicate konzetsuru, homophobia, and to make the presence of LGBTQ+ individuals more visible in the society through AIDS activism. So let's go back to the word queer. Queer activism made possible by AIDS activism reclaimed this derogatory term as their own in an attempt to not only denaturalize heterosexuality but also critique and resist heteronormativity. By reclaiming queer as their own, people in both queer activism and AIDS activism explored desires, identities, practices, and relationships that people never seen before. With the changes in social movements from the gay liberation movement, AIDS activism, and to queer activism in the 1980s, scholars specialized in gender and sexuality studies in humanities started a new discipline called queer studies. What marked the rise of queer studies was the paper called Queer Theory, Lesbian and Gay Sexualities, an introduction by media scholar Teresa de Lautis in 1991. The emergence of queer studies included works such as Gender Trouble by Judith Butler and Epistemology of Closet by Eve Kozlowski-Sedgwick. What queer studies focuses is the power relationship between the majority and the minority, the solidarity of socially marginalized people. Although the word queer is sometimes used to describe people part of the LGBTQ communities, it is important to understand that queer is more of an attitude than an identity. That is to say, queer as an attitude helps us fight against the power and the authority as system, and queer is a perspective that aims to subvert the oppressive system in the society. The purpose of queer studies is to offer us a perspective that helps us thoroughly question the oppressive system that forces the idea of being normal by resisting norms regarding being normal set by the majority in terms of sexuality, gender, age, body size, ability, and so on. This has been a long explanation about the word queer, but it is extremely important to grasp what it means as you listen to this lecture and next week. Employing in this historical development of the word queer as part of activism and part of academic discourses, I specialize in film studies, particularly focusing on reconstructing the dominant discourses in the studies of Japanese cinema created by white, cisgender, heterosexual men who have often ignored the existence of sexual minorities in visual cultures in Japan. Now, let's move on to the possible definitions of queer films. According to Queer Images, A History of Gay and Lesbian Film in America by Harry Benshoff and Sean Griffin, there are 3 possible ways to define what a queer film is. One possible way to define queer films is whether or not films both contain LGBTQ characters and engage with LGBTQ plus issues in some meaningful way, as opposed to derogatory and exploitative ways. Another possible way of defining queer films is via authorship. Films might be considered to be depicting the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people when they are written, directed, or produced by members of LGBTQ plus communities. The other possible way to define queer films is via spectatorship. In humanities, when analyzing films and or novels, forming an alternative reading of the text that resists dominant interpretation is often referred as reading against the grain, 決めに逆らって読む. When thinking about how films could offer a queer point of views, it is interesting that any films could be potentially queer films if it provides a possibility of resisting the oppressive power that marginalizes minorities in the society. Even if a film centers on a love story between a man and a woman, there's always a possibility to read it as reflecting experiences of sexual minorities. For instance, 君の水蔵を食べたい is on the surface about an unaccomplished intimate relationship between the protagonist and the heroine. The sense of failure throughout this film reminds us of an impossibility of an intimate relationship between those who are not meant to be together in society following the strict norms of sexuality and gender. Having learned the definition of the word queer and of queer films, let's look at the present state of queer films and television dramas in Japan in order to point out some of the current problems we must be aware of. As some of you may be familiar with the phrase so-called the LGBTQ or LGBT boom since the early 2010s, we have started to see a rapid increase in the number of films and television dramas that feature LGBTQ characters in central roles. For instance, Cherry Maho has succeeded in gaining huge popularity last year, depicting an accomplishment of the same-sex relationship as a goal, as well as a young woman in supporting role who seems to be aromantic, asexual. Other examples of television dramas include 昨日何食べた and 小滝兄弟と宿泊. And as Teren Sensei illustrated in the lecture on Asadora, NHK has been doing a great job on bringing in LGBTQ representations on public television, especially for the last few years as well. So what about cinema? Japanese films have also paid close attention to the necessity of telling stories about the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people in Japan. Some examples include Rikiya Imaizumi's His, Akihiko Shiota's さよなら唇, Naoko Gigami's 彼らが本気で編むときは, and Shun Nakagawa's カランコエの花. The reason why I used the word necessity is that these films seem to be in part responses to recent activism and social movements aiming to achieve equal rights for LGBTQ plus individuals in Japan. While we should appreciate their creative efforts to make these film projects come true, we must also consider the fact that one of the aspects of making commercial films, 商業映画, or whatever artistic creations that may be, is to make profits out of whatever topics they are dealing with. Here, we need to understand the meaning of the word boom. According to Cambridge English Dictionary, two primary meanings of the word boom are as follows. One is an increase in something or a time when something becomes more popular. With this definition, the LGBT boom seems to reflect increasing interest in improving equal rights for sexual minorities in Japanese society. The initialism LGBT first started to appear in Japanese newspapers around the year 2004, and a number of its appearances gradually increased in the 2010s, especially after Shibuyaku implemented the same-sex partnership scheme in 2015. The use of the word boom in this context shows how the LGBT boom is a reflection of people's awareness. The second definition is as follows. A period of sudden economic growth, especially one that results in a lot of money being made. While this first definition is worthwhile, I believe that the LGBT boom in Japan is more closely associated with economic profits, as illustrated by this second definition. According to sociologist Hitoshi Ishida and Junko Mitsuhashi, the LGBT boom had started since 2012 when two business magazines, Shukan Diamondo and Toyo Keizai, featured articles on pink money, expecting that companies would be able to make tremendous profits by specifically targeting sexual minorities. Since then, advertising agencies such as Dentsu and Hakuhodo have come up with film and television drama projects that aimed at sexual minorities. Commodity is one of the most important keywords to understanding what culture consists of. So an increase in the number of films that television dramas featuring LGBTQ plus characters in one way may show the development and expansion of queer visual culture in Japan. Yet, on the other hand, those involved with some people in the productions of LGBTQ plus themed media seem to be lacking the historical background of how queer representations in Japanese visual culture have developed in the 20th century, and that some people behave as if the present is much better than the past. When conducting historical researches, especially on LGBTQ plus experiences, this forward thinking may be too hasty. Therefore, based on my research in order to curate the exhibition, Inside Out LGBTQ plus representation in film and television at Waseda University, the latter half of today's lecture will show you what can be discovered by looking backward. One of the earliest films that mentioned the word dosei was Judai no Seiten, released in 1953. It depicts two female high school students whose intimate relationship is subject to a rumor among other students as homosexual one. Representations of possible homosexuality in Japanese cinema from the 1950s to the 1960s were often between young women, and when male characters who seemed to be depicted as homosexual were always effeminate men, as seen in Jiugakko, Aodora Musume, and Onna de Aru Koto. A number of researchers to reconstruct the post-war Japanese cinema history from a queer point of view developed by practicing reading of pleasure or reading against the grain. For instance, queer film scholars Robin Wood and Yuka Kanno have investigated the importance of actor Setsuko Hara, whose star persona from the pre-war to the post-war eras seemed to have attracted more women than men. In the post-war era, she was often referred to as Eien no Shoujo, an eternal virgin. By studying how Hara's star persona was established through publicity and paying attention to the use of the word hentai, often used to describe homosexual desire or perverse desires in the post-war and in the pre-war Japan, Wood and Kanno have explored possibilities of reading Hara's character Noriko in Yasujiro Ozu's film Bakushu as a lesbian. As members of LGBTQ+ communities, both Wood and Kanno have provided examples of how queer spectatorship could subvert a dominant reading of one of the most famous Japanese films. If you like to read articles by Wood and Kanno, you can check the references at the end of the slides. After the war, Japanese film industry was under the censorship by GHQ during the occupation era. The film censorship by GHQ was said to have been based on the production code in Hollywood, effective from 1934 to 1968. One of the examples of censorship was that Japanese film studios could not make any jidaigeki with chambara because swords were restricted as a symbol of Japanese militarism. The film censorship by GHQ gradually eased by the end of the 1940s, and Japanese film industry was allowed to establish its own motion picture code of ethics committee in 1949, which would be later called Aiding, that still exists today. By the end of 1956, after Japan entered its economic miracle or rapid economic growth, Aiding was reorganized into a self-financing independent body called Aiding Kanri Iinkai. Interestingly, the 1959 version of Aiding Ethics Codes described restrictions on representations of perverse sexuality, including homosexuality and gay boy, showing how homosexuality was considered to be outside the rule of ethics that Japanese people should practice. Therefore, it should be restricted on the screen as well. Then you should ask a question. Did Japanese filmmakers never depict homosexuality, homoerotic representations, or any relationships that could invite alternative readings in the 1940s and 1950s? My answer would be yes, there were. There were those who managed to slip in possibilities of reading against the grain. One of the most important figures in reconstructing the Japanese cinema history from a queer point of view is Keisuke Kinoshita, who is well known for his 1954 film Nijushi no Hitomi. His films such as Ojo-san Kanpai, Carmen Kokyo ni Kaeru, Yuyake Gumo, and Sekishuncho are filled with juicy elements that allow us to easily overcome dominant interpretations that overlook complex emotions that characters form as they face heteronormative pressure by the post-war Japanese society. Although Kinoshita was well known by his co-workers and families that he was, in today's words, gay, because he never came out to the public, it is necessary not to overemphasize his sexuality. Instead, we must seek for possibilities of queer spectatorship by closely analyzing the films and also by connecting social and historical discourses on homosexuality at the time when Kinoshita or other filmmakers you are interested in worked. While homosexuality was subject to film censorship in the post-war era, it didn't mean that there were no homosexuals on the screen, as I argued before. As I mentioned earlier, female homosexuality was clearly represented at least as early as 1953. When looking back at the history of homosexuality on the screen in Japanese cinema, you will notice how lesbian representations were more abundant than those of gay in the 1950s and 1960s, during which the Japanese film industry put lots of efforts in film adaptations from the novel known as Bungei Eiga. And it was these Bungei Eiga that functioned as a platform for visualizing lesbians on the screen. To give you some examples, Banka, based on Yasuko Harada's novel, Unna de Aru Koto, based on Yasunari Kawabata, Onna Bakari no Yoru, based on Masako Yana's novel, and Manji, based on Junichiro Tanizaki, and Utsukushisa to Kanashimi to, based on Yasunari Kawabata, are all used younger actresses as lesbians or bisexuals, and it is probably necessary to point out that the fact that these lesbians or bisexual women were often depicted as peculiar or strange, a sort of fear to the heterosexist society. I'm still doing research on why film studios put resources into lesbian representations in Bungei Eiga, but I believe it was one of the ways to allure male audiences to movie theaters and also, the queer audiences back then. The number of moviegoers peaked in December 1958 with 11 oku nin and 3000 man nin. Since then, the number dropped significantly due to the popularity of television at home. So in the 1960s, film studios geared towards making films that would attract male audiences with erotic expressions and younger audiences with seishun eiga starring new popular young actors like Sayuri Yoshinaga. The 1960s was also a decade in which Toei and Nikkatsu started to make action films filled with new male actors who had lean bodies and much darker tone than the previous generations. Toei, for instance, began making Ninkyo Eiga in 1963. Ninkyo is a different term from Yakuza, but I won't go into details today here. Ninkyo Eiga became such a popular genre, gaining lots of male fans and enjoyed the longevity, inviting many new actors to the screen. One of the attractions of Ninkyo Eiga is, of course, action scenes, but to me, Ninkyo Eiga also invites queer readings of male-male relationships valued so significantly and warmly on the screen. For instance, at the end of the first Ninkyo Eiga, Jinsei Gekijo Hishakaku, there is a scene in which one of the male characters dies after being stabbed many times. And then the film's protagonist cries for and embraces the dying man and screams the name of the man who just died in his arms. It's like a Ninkyo, call me by your name moment, but This strong sense of male-male intimacy has become a legacy that other Ninkyo eiga protected. As film scholar Ayako Saito has argued, Ninkyo eiga is also filled with homoerotic moments, while it was the genre that a large number of male audiences went to see and cried in movie theaters. What does it then tell us about the sense of same-sex intimacy that tends to be so valued by both men and women in Japanese culture, in which homosexuality has been marginalized and oppressed at the same time? The 1960s also saw changes in the landscape of the Japanese film industry. One of such changes included the emergence of experimental films enabled by inventions of 8mm and 16mm film cameras available much cheaper than before. A new generation of filmmakers who did not belong to any major film studios such as Shochiku and Toei started to make their own films with 8mm films for home movies and 16mm films for documentary and experimental narrative films. One of the figures who led the emergence of Japanese experimental films was Donald Richie. He came to Japan during the occupation and contributed significantly to introducing Japanese films to foreign countries in English. In the 1960s, with Shuji Terayama and other figures in an underground art movement, Richie made a number of short films, some of which included homoerotic moments. His works are quite important to the landscape of experimental queer cinema in Japan, but when thinking about what Japanese culture is, what happens to the works by non-Japanese individuals as well? Would it be different if the person spoke Japanese or spoke no Japanese? What are some of the requirements or credentials for considering a film, novel, manga, or any work as part of Japanese culture or part of any particular culture? Let's now move on to the last section of today's lecture, pink films. As its box office profits dropped significantly, Nikkatsu decided to shift to making pink films in 1971, called Nikkatsu Roman Porno. It is a genre of seijin eiga, which means that no admission under 18 years old is allowed, and it targeted heterosexual men by providing stories with softcore pornographic scenes. Lasting until 1988, as a genre, Nikkatsu Roman Porno were usually 60 minutes long and had to include erotic scenes every 5 to 10 minutes. Nikkatsu Roman Porno was the strategy Nikkatsu took to survive in financially difficult times during the flourishment of television dramas. So why do we need to talk about Nikkatsu Roman Porno if its primary audience geographic was heterosexual men? It is because Nikkatsu Roman Porno included lesbians, gay, and transgender characters when mainstream commercial films did not sufficiently represented sexual minorities on the screen. For instance, Momojiri Musume Love Attack depicts high school gay boy as one of the central characters, and Karusel Maki Yoru wa Watashi o Nurasu casts Karusel Maki, who had sex reassignment surgery in 1973, as a central woman. Although it is extremely important to look back at the history of sexual exploitation that happened during the production of Nikkatsu Roman Porno, this particular pink film genre seems to have paved the way for another pink film category targeting gay audiences. Motivated by the success of Nikkatsu Roman Porno, there were attempts to make pink films for gay audiences as early as 1980. Barazoku Eiga, as a subcategory of pink films, started in 1982 and developed well into the 1990s. telling stories of male-male romance by reappropriating conventions of existing film genres. I will briefly talk about the historical context of the 1980s next week, but the emergence of Barazoku eiga provided a significant turn in the history of Japanese queer cinema. While there is an urgent necessity to reflect the past of sexual exploitation by pink films, as I mentioned earlier, we must also examine the historical and social significance of pink films in depicting sexual minorities. It is because overlooking their existence and significance explicitly suggests a possibility of burying the presence of individuals unvoiced within the communities of minority in the darkness. When I created an exhibition on Japanese queer cinema at Waseda University, showing the results of academic research conducted by film scholars on Nikkatsu Roman porno and Barazoku eiga especially, the university's Office for Promotion and Equality and Diversity, Diversity Suishinshitsu, surprisingly denied to sponsor the exhibition because of this content on pink films. I was really shocked to receive such a heartful message that suggested me a sheer fact that this whole illusion or fantasy of diversity or tayosei claimed by such a prestigious university was just a show off, excluding and erasing any memories, voices, representations of minorities that could be obstacles to achieve positive images of minorities. So my job as film scholar and your task as students taking this course is to question the validity of the power and the authority that not only the educational system but also specific disciplines that you are interested in may have. As a last remark for today, when we talk about culture, ask yourself, who is marginalized? Whose voice is missing? And what kind of power makes us feel numb to the absence of voices and memories of minorities in culture? For the assignment for next week, please think about and answer the following question on web class. Provide 2 examples of cultural products in Japan, such as film, television drama, music video, video games, novels, anime, manga, theater performance, painting and photography, etc., that you believe represent lived experiences of sexual minorities and or a strong sense of same-sex intimacy. Please explain why you have chosen those cultural products as well. Here are the sources I used for this lecture, and here are some of the resources you can use at Kanagawa University. See you all in the next lecture. Bye-bye.